Representative, welcome back to the program here. Right now, survivors of child sexual abuse in this state have 30 years from their 18th birthday if they want to sue their perpetrator in civil court. You introduced a bill that's going to eliminate that timeline. This seems like an easy fix to me to existing Texas law.
Me too. But this is now the third session in a row where we have offered this legislation, and I hope for the first time that we will get a hearing so that other Texans can hear from the victims who have suffered abuse at the hands of individuals, oftentimes that were being shielded by organizations or institutions that have avoided civil responsibility. Meaning, in Texas, we recognize that if you're a perpetrator, that there is no statute of limitations. Meaning at any point in time that somebody comes forward and says that they were abused as a child, that individual can be held accountable. Those criminal courthouse doors are open, but right now the civil courthouse doors are closed. And to me, that doesn't make sense, especially when you look at the stories that have come out more recently that really highlight what we have known about this community and population. People who are victimized as children often repress that or don't bring it out because of feelings of shame or guilt or that they have done something wrong. And many times those victims don't disclose and come forward until they're around the age of 52. And at that point, Texas law says that their story can't be heard in such a way that could hold those perpetrators accountable and affect real change for kids coming in the future.
This didn't get out of committee last session. Why not?
It didn't even get a hearing. And so again, in the 87th and the 88th, these victims were not allowed to be heard. And I do hope and will pray that whoever's in a position of being the chair of a committee that gets this bill will recognize that these voices should no longer be silenced. We have seen it since the last session, the strength of victims like Cindy Clemishire, who's come forward and talked about what happened to her from Reverend Robert Morris. That's an important story, and she is just one of many, because we know that about 1 in 4 girls are abused as children and 1 in 14. And so to know today that you are hearing Cindy's story, think of how many others you haven't. But more importantly, how many perpetrators are still out there or are part of an entity or organization that is taking advantage of a vulnerable population. I'm your former chief human trafficking prosecutor in Harris County, and I can tell you that sexual predators will find vulnerable kids where they exist, whether we're talking about a mall or social media on their phone, and even in places where you think kids would be protected, in churches, in clubs. And so the issue is, if those organizations haven't cleaned up their house, haven't figured out how to have volunteers and people coming in contact with vulnerable kids and keeping them safe, then the public needs to know and the courthouse doors need to be open. Because if they are held accountable, they will make and affect change that will prevent the future abuse. And that ought to be the goal of every Texan.
Let's talk about the politics of this for a moment. There's no statute of limitations for these victims in criminal court. You're trying to get one in civil court. Tell me who is against this. Is it churches, these other large childhood organizations, or who is it that's actively campaigning behind the scenes to prevent this from getting heard in committee?
Well, that's part of the issue. Because we haven't had a committee hearing, the public doesn't know the answer to that question. The public hasn't had a chance to have Cindy and other victims come forward and testify, figure out who's for this bill, and actually have those people that are against it, and we do know that there are people against it, have those people actually come forward and say no, that they're asking Texas law to continue to shield them from any court responsibility. But we know who perpetrators are. We've heard about the Southern Baptist Convention. We've heard about the Boy Scouts. We've heard about some of the church abuse scandals and whether or not those people ought to be held accountable. I'm not sure what Texas is afraid of. There have been many states, in fact, the majority of states have said, right this wrong, open up the civil courthouse doors and give a chance for these victims to be heard. And guess what? All these organizations still exist. The sky has not fallen. They have not been sent into ruin. The frightening things that people will say have to keep us from allowing these victims to be heard are not happening in any other state, and I don't believe they would happen here in Texas. What I do believe would happen if you opened up the hearing room, if you opened up the courthouse doors and you heard from these victims, then every Texan would learn about what's a good organization and what's not, who's protecting kids and who's not. What are the signs of sexual abuse? What about that child that all of a sudden starts having trouble with their grades, or all of a sudden starts wetting the bed when they shouldn't, or all of a sudden has anger or depression, and you see that change in them, that over time, many would say, oh, that's just a bad kid. Most of the time, those kids have gone down a path of trouble because they're traumatized. And what Cindy highlights is that her perpetrator has done incredibly well for himself, even to the extent that he has told her story for her, and she has not been able to have an opportunity to have the court really hear what happened to her and decide who was right, who was wrong, and what's the amount of correction that needs to be done here for this young child.
Do you think the reason this legislation hasn't moved in Austin is because of money, all about the bottom line for these large organizations that don't want to cut checks to these victims?
I hope not. I hope that it's just maybe people before Cindy and others got the attention that they've gotten, and people have realized this is very real. It has happened and is happening in Texas and is worth fighting for. I hope, as I've heard from many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, that they think it's time to talk about it. And so I'm going to be optimistic about the faith of the membership that we're a part of in the legislature to right a wrong when we now know it's there. And I don't think anybody can deny it any further. And so whatever the motivation has been, I think we are long past the time to have these victims heard, figure out if Texas law has been shielding them from responsibility, squashing the truth of what's happened to them, and kept them from making their victims whole. And can we be prepared for a better Texas in the future? This is the thing I don't get about these groups, if they are the ones that are resisting. If you've really cleaned up your problem, why are you afraid of the future? Why do you continue to need protection and shielding from the civil law in the future? If you're doing it right, then you have nothing to be afraid of. So let's talk about it. And if they're not doing it right, then let's figure that out.
If this bill passed, it would be retroactive, I believe I read. How many victims do you think there are out there in Texas that might take advantage of this new legislation if it passed?
I don't know how many would be ready to take advantage of it, but I think this is an issue for us as Texas legislators to know that there are some. Do we want to open the doors for them and say your voice is meaningful? And I've watched some of the video you've done with some other members and colleagues that have talked about the personal experience of hearing from victims. And that's what happened, and why I brought this bill is because a friend of mine who I never knew what had happened, and I don't believe they had told anybody else, talked to me as a lawyer late in life and explained how they were a victim of child abuse, of a situation that they shouldn't have been in, and that they had carried the pain of that story for decades, the shame of that story for decades. And when simply asked, what can I do? And I said, here's what Texas law says is available to you. And to say that you can go to the DA's office and you can file a claim if you want, but to the person that took advantage of you, you can't take them into civil court. You can't have that story heard. You can't have that case done by your own team investigating the situation. And you can't put that individual under oath. That is part of the suffering of knowing not only have they been silenced by their perpetrator and the shame that their perpetrator put on them, but it's been exacerbated and helped by the state of Texas and the civil court system. I don't think we should participate any longer. So whatever that number of folks are, give them their day in court, right the wrong, and set it for the future. Say, we won't do this again. We will never, ever have anybody like Cindy or anybody else have those doors closed to them. And that when they want, like any other victim in the state of Texas, to come forward, that they can. I do not understand why the state of Texas continues to shield sexual predators and the organizations that have protected them.
Do you think there's something actively being, do you think that someone is working actively in the background to prevent this legislation from getting a hearing?
I hope not, but we'll find out, because this is now the third session in a row where this piece of legislation and the request for a hearing is going to be put out to say, I'm asking you to hear from these victims. I'm asking you to at least give them their day in the legislature. And if you feel compelled to fix it, then let's fix it. But if you hear from them and think that you can continue to shield the perpetrators, they can make that decision too. I just don't think they will. I think when they hear from these folks, they'll want to make it right. And you're right. Maybe that's why there's a reason that these folks are not getting a hearing. But I think we're getting beyond that. I think that the voices that have been lifted, the stories that have been told, the victims who are willing to come forward, that they too, and I think it will just continue to get louder until we just acknowledge it, address it, acknowledge it, and become like the majority of every other state in this nation to say that these victims can be heard in court.
Before I let you go, I do want to ask about politics in the party and in the House. Who do you plan to support for Speaker of the House, Dade Phelan or someone else?
Well, as you know, we're getting ready for that in January 14th, and I will do all of our due diligence, look at those that are there for speaker, and I will vote for the person that gives me the best opportunity to represent our constituency in our district. I think the other question that ought to be asked out of that speaker question is, are everyday Texans ready for the extremism that's being pushed by this new group? Are everyday Texans ready for this new group of individuals that are hell-bent on turning the Texas House into Washington, D.C., saying simple majority wins, and that both parties can't be heard from? I think one of the greatest strengths of the Texas House has been bipartisanship, has been the ability to sit down, talk across the aisle, and do big things like supporting victims of sexual assault or anything else. But that means we have to work together. And I know, being on the campaign trail, there are few people that tell me, hey, let's get more extreme. Most everybody is telling me, let's find a way to get back to bipartisanship, getting beyond the extremist politics and the scorched earth, and get down to doing things for the benefit of all Texans. So that's my goal.
Do you think Dade Phelan survives as Speaker?
We'll find out on January 14th. I hope that the Texas House and the history of the chamber that allowed all voices to be lifted and all constituents to be represented, I hope that holds. And I think that's what's on the line.
And Representative, how about the Democratic Party? It's going to be looking for a new leader here statewide shortly. What would you like to see that person be like, or who would you like to see in that role?
I'd like to see somebody that's ready to take on the challenge of making sure that everyday Texans realize that it's actually Democrats that are fighting for your rights and your freedoms. It's Democrats that are upholding and keeping up public trust and being against public corruption that we've seen kind of ravage the state for a while now. I think it's time that we have a leader that makes sure that Texans know that it is Democrats, and it was a group of rural Republicans that were standing up for public education until the governor campaigned on a lie and eliminated them before this next session. I think it's up to that individual to make sure Texans know that common sense gun safety, that my family that lives in rural Texas, they need certain weapons, but being in downtown Houston, maybe we don't need AR-15s with 18-year-olds. Maybe we need to make sure that schools are safe and that there's a bigger meaning on school safety. I hope that there will be a leader that will tell everybody that, you know what, we still have the highest rate of uninsured children in the nation, and we still have the highest rate of maternal mortality and morbidity, and surely everybody must be ready for some better path. I hope that that leader will tell Texans that we care about moms and their reproductive rights, and if they're in the middle of a pregnancy complication, that medical professionals should be able to treat them in Texas rather than trying to flee this state because they're afraid of prosecution for providing pregnancy complication treatments that are modern medical technologies and therapies. And so we got a lot on our plate as Democrats, but I look forward to the next leader being up to the task.
Representative, good to see you again. Thank you for the time.
Thank you.